Liberty Me Live. We're here tonight with Zach Gochenour. We're going to be talking about the legacy of Gordon Tullock, who unfortunately died last month. He was a great economist, though he didn't have a PhD in economics. He probably contributed more to the way economists think about the economics, the political economy of politics, than almost anyone else almost anyone who had an economics degree. So we're here with Zach Gochenour, of course, who is a visiting assistant professor of economics at Western Carolina University. He got his PhD from George Mason and also got his bachelor's degree in economics and a BA in mathematics from George Mason as well. He was a research assistant for Professor Brian Kaplan, who many of you certainly know and respect. And he writes on the economics of immigration and also has a paper that's one of my favorite papers of last year on war and presidential greatness with David Henderson. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Zach.
Thanks, Matt. I was asked to come talk about Gordon Tullock's legacy, which is certainly an honor to do so. Gordon Tullock is one of my biggest influences personally, but he certainly influenced a lot of economists with greater note than me. So let's get to it. Gordon Tullock. Oh, there's supposed to be a Tullock picture here. Anyway, he did unfortunately die last year. Of course, it's not too late for the Nobel Committee to change their mind and start offering prizes to posthumously, but given their current rules, he will never get the prize that he deserves. But he is best known for his work in public choice theory and rent-seeking. I guess rent-seeking is part of public choice theory, but public choice theory as a broad program of research in economics, and rent-seeking is probably the idea that he's most known for. So we'll talk about both of those contributions to some extent here. Education-wise, he received his JD in 1947 from University of Chicago, which he would later, way later, get an honorary PhD in economics from University of Chicago. But he actually only took one class in economics as an undergraduate. And he doesn't have a baccalaureate degree because he failed to, or decided not to, give them the $5 remittance required in order to get his BA. So he only has his JD, which was interrupted a bit by the fact that he was drafted to fight in World War II. So we'll talk a little bit about his personal life there. Yes, one class is all you need, especially if you're Gordon Tullock, who is, as Buchanan used to always say, his frequent collaborator and famous co-writer there, would say that he's a natural economist, and that is certainly true. He had a natural, I guess you'd say, affinity for the study of economics, and he wrote articles in economics and got them published before he even had any sort of academic appointment. So we'll talk a little bit about that too. So he spent much of his career with James Buchanan, who is pretty well known as well, also passed away recently, unfortunately. And their work together is very highly cited in the profession. So he studied law and he intended to become a lawyer, which he did. He was an attorney for a couple of years, and he was an okay attorney. He won some cases, but his heart wasn't really in it. But he was interrupted from his studies to go participate in World War II. He was part of the infantry, the 9th Infantry, landed on Normandy for the D-Day invasion. So he once said, under democracy, I found myself walking on a beach in Normandy, and I wasn't very happy about it. And that was part of his, I guess, one of his many quips that he's known for. And he was often very quick to denounce sacred cows that people had. So Okay, so military service, which he wasn't very happy about, and he always said was uneventful, even though he crossed the Rhine went into what would eventually be Russian territory. He was all over Europe during that campaign. Afterwards, he passed the what's notoriously difficult foreign service examination and did some work for the U.S. State Department in China, which they trained him on how to speak Chinese. He did some work at Yale learning that, and his experience in China led him to write a couple of articles on the monetary economics of China and Korea. Got those published before he ever stepped foot back in a university at a graduate level. He spent several years there, and I think that his work there got him to really think about the economics of politics, and really got him thinking. He wrote a lot on the economics of bureaucracy at this time, would eventually publish a book on that topic. After the Foreign Service, he came back and got into an academic career. University of South Carolina. He would eventually join Jim Buchanan at UVA, which they had a great department there, which they completely ruined by failing to promote certain people, failing to give them the support that they needed. They at one point had Coase, Buchanan, Tullock. They lost everybody good, or at least a good chunk of everybody good, and big loss for them. So Tullock and Buchanan went to VPI, which is now Virginia Tech. They were there for many years. They eventually got fed up there as well, and they came to George Mason, where they spent a huge part, both of them spent a huge part of their career there. At one point, Tullock left and went to University of Arizona, and then he came back to George Mason University. He was a professor of economics and law at GMU. Unfortunately, I didn't overlap with him. He retired just a couple of years before I started, which is very sad for me and for the rest of the department. They definitely missed having him. Okay, so who influenced Tullock? Let's say the Austrian School of Economics. He often credited as being a huge influence on him. He read Human Action when he was an undergraduate, part of around the same time when he was taking that one class which he took with Simons. I say that he was a big influence because I'm sure that had that really introduced him to the study of economics, the formal study of economics, which he would eventually contribute a lot to, even though he didn't decide to go get a PhD or anything like that. I don't want to undersell this Austrian school thing. So even though he did write quite a bit critical of other quote-unquote Austrian economists, he was very critical of things like the Austrian business cycle theory, which he wrote a great article on that. And I wouldn't necessarily say you would call him a member of the school, like dyed in the wool type thing, but certainly his approach to economics. Read the first 100 pages of Human Action, and just the idea that Mises had that you apply economics to everything. This is a way of understanding all human behavior, not some narrow area of human behavior. Very important to Tullock, who is one of the great economic imperialists, we often say. Let's see. Also influenced by the social choice school, often Tullock and Buchanan are called the founding fathers of public choice. If there is a real predecessor to that, a direct predecessor, be Duncan Black and Anthony Downs, who started to apply these rational choice models to the study of politics, but didn't really have the formalization that Tullock and Buchanan would later bring to it. But I'd say these are the big influences. If you're familiar with Pete Boettke's work on a mainline economics, sort of going all the way back to Adam Smith and the classical economists who worked in his tradition, and then moving through with marginalism, moving into Menger, and moving into the Austrian school, and combining that with the real solid microeconomics of the Chicago school and the schools that they influence, like UCLA, you could sort of see this big overarching school of thought going all the way back to Adam Smith, which, like I said, Pete Becky calls the main line of economics, as opposed to a mainstream. So I wouldn't say Tullock was necessarily a mainstream economist. He didn't chase after the whatever was new or cool. He wasn't particularly technically sophisticated. He prided himself. He never like ran regressions. He did a lot of work in game theory, but he was no mathematician. He was just a really good economist who really understood economics and applied it to things that people who are too caught up in current trends could probably not think to apply it to. So looking at Tullock's work, we'll go to the calculus of consent, because this is what really sets us up for having a public choice school of economics. So this is a work that grew out of both Buchanan and Tullock's work. So Buchanan asked Tullock to be involved in this project and come work with him at UVA, etc. They co-wrote this together. What Tullock had written, this economic theory of constitutions, would eventually become a part of the book Calculus of Consent, which, if you're reading it, there's definitely a style difference between what was contributed by Tullock and what was contributed by Buchanan, but they were basically giving a rational choice model of political behavior. Constitutions, how rules are formed, how collective action is formed, and taking all the romance, Jim Buchanan wrote Politics Without Romance as a sort of an introduction to public choice. So taking the romance or the civics class view of politics and setting that aside and saying, look, why don't we treat political actors just like other types of economic actors, and get away from this idea that the government works in some weird way that we can't explain with economics. There were, at the time, go back to the 1950s and 60s and look at what economists were writing, and a lot of times they were falling victim to what Stigler would call the nirvana fallacy. That is sort of saying, okay, we identified this problem in markets, and therefore let's just end our analysis there and say we can solve this problem by going and bringing in a government to help fix whatever market failures we've identified. So the idea behind Buchanan and Tullock's work in public choice was to say, no, let's be a little bit more critical in our analysis and then see where that leads us. So I'd say that really revolutionized how economists and then later political scientists and the whole rational choice school of political science, how they all think about politics. Yeah. And a lot of times, it's not that people will always cite Tullock or cite Buchanan, or it's more of just it really changed the way they thought about it, because now we can now use economics to analyze this type of behavior, whereas before we weren't doing that so much. Within the school of public choice, the idea that Tullock is most well known for is this idea of rent seeking. Okay? And the idea here is that we incur costs to increase our wealth share without increasing the total wealth. Okay? So what that means is sometimes I might want to increase my wealth, so maybe I start a business. Okay, that's not rent seeking. That's me creating new wealth. But if I see that there's some sort of monopoly that's available, if I lobby the government for that monopoly and I spend a lot of resources on that, that's rent seeking. Okay. So the article which introduces this idea, formalizes this idea, is a 1967 article, his by far most famous and most cited, on the welfare costs of tariffs, monopolies, and theft. Right, and in that article, he would argue that welfare costs were vastly underestimated by the traditional approach. And just, let's see. I had a picture there, but for some reason it's not there. Not important. The idea is that if you are familiar, if you've taken an economics class and you think about a deadweight loss triangle, what they call a Harburger triangle, where there's either too little or too much production, and therefore there's this allocated inefficiency there. That's only a very small part, according to Tullock, of the whole deadweight loss that we should really be considering. So it's not just that we now have a little bit too much or a little bit not enough production. It's that there's this monopoly profit available, and if that monopoly profit is sort of up for sale, you could say, if the government is able to grant you, say, a monopoly or protect you from competition, say, from other countries, then whatever the value of that monopoly profit is, well, that's how much you would be willing to spend in order to protect, or in order to gain that privilege. Okay, so it's not just you; it's all of your competitors are also thinking about how they would like to gain that privilege. So they'll spend resources on how to get it. And I think a lot of Tullock's other work comes from this very basic idea that if you allow rents to be created, if there are rents out there, people will expend resources in order to get it, and that leads us to some really inefficient outcomes. Okay, so some of the other things that he was really well known for writing about that are still related to that idea are in the field of law in economics, which he was a sort of a founding member of as well. One thing I'd really like to talk about is the transitional gains trap. This still gets lots of cites. He first talked about it, formalized it in 1975 article for the Bell Journal of Economics. And what he's saying here is that a lot of times someone will end up with some kind of rent or some benefit, and we would like, perhaps as a society, to buy them out of that benefit. But we don't have that capability because that requires collective action. So just for an example, okay, say you sell taxi medallions in New York City, and the first people who get the taxi medallions, of course, they now have this huge rent because no one can compete with them without the medallions. So they go for a long time, and then all of a sudden we realize, wait a minute, we didn't issue enough taxi medallions, and the population of New York City is much higher than it used to be. We need more taxis, but there's a problem. If we try to sell more medallions, we're going to be reducing the value of the original rent. So who should we expect to fight against the issuing of new medallions? Well, we should expect the taxi companies to fight against that. Okay, so he applied this to a lot of other cases. I really like another example with blue laws. So what's the idea there? Blue laws mean you can't do business on Sundays. So what happens when you pass a law that says no one can do business on Sundays? Well, then everyone needs to do their shopping on Monday through Saturday. Maybe someone has to open up a new store because a lot of people want to go shopping, and the stores are too crowded, so it's very costly to stand in line and all that other stuff. So more stores get opened. Now all of a sudden we realize, wait a minute, these blue laws were stupid. We want to be able to shop on Sunday, but we can't just repeal that law because then there are actually now too many stores. So the stores who exist now are going to lobby and spend a lot of resources in order to protect their gain. Okay, so there's a lot of really good work has come from that. Examples of that are more than you can really count. Okay, other things that he wrote about, he has a great case against common law. So there's a lot of work. Libertarians seem to love common law. Tullock's was sort of a contrarian. He sort of jumped out and said, wait a minute, common law doesn't make that much sense because you've got this adversarial system. So one side is spending a ton of money in order to defend, and then in order to defeat the defense, the prosecution spends a ton of money in order to prosecute. And wouldn't it be better if we just had a system where there wasn't that adversarial relationship and people were actually just looking for the truth? Now, he didn't really explore, like, well, what would actually happen in reality. He wasn't like out there lobbying to get rid of common law. He's just saying that common law has an inefficiency within it that a lot of people probably aren't really thinking about. A lot of wasted resources. Doesn't mean that it could still be the best system that's available, but it's not perfect. One thing that he's pretty well known for is this automobile safety idea, which I don't actually remember which paper it comes from, but people talk about it all the time, so it's worth mentioning. His idea here is that there's an increase, once you require people to wear seatbelts, there's an increase in car accidents and car fatalities. And the idea is, well, how does that make sense? And I always use this with my intro economics classes, just to get people to think about unintended consequences. All right, so the idea is, okay, now that you're wearing a seatbelt, now that you're required to wear a seatbelt, you always had the option to wear a seatbelt, okay? But now that you're required to wear a seatbelt, if you don't really value that increased safety, you can say, well, look, I'm safer now, therefore I can drive faster. So what happens when you pass a law that tells everyone that they have to wear seatbelts? People drive faster. When people drive faster, they still sometimes get into accidents and then they die. So he was pretty famous for recommending, instead of a seatbelt requirement or a requirement for airbags or whatever, why don't they install a big spike? And the spike could be coming right out of the steering wheel, and then you would actually now think about, wait a minute, what are my incentives here? If I drive too fast and I get into an accident, the stake is going to go right into my heart, rather than thinking, oh, if I get into an accident, there's going to be a big airbag that's going to protect me and a seatbelt that's going to protect me and that kind of thing. So he's very well known for applying the idea that incentives and costs matter, and applying it to a ton of different topics that no one had really thought of. So the biggest part of his legacy, and I want to keep coming back to this point, the biggest part of his legacy is applying the economic way of thinking to every aspect of human behavior, and not just a very narrow range of market transactions and that kind of thing. So when they first created the journal, which would become Public Choice, it was called Papers in Non-Market Decision Making. And his biggest, his area of research, I guess you could really call non-market decision making. Probably the best class I took at George Mason was Peter Leeson taught a class in non-market decision making, and it was kind of based on the ideas, what kind of topics did people talk about at George Mason or at UVA when Tullock and Buchanan are really first starting this idea. It wasn't all politics. Of course, politics is a huge part of non-market decision making. Yeah. A lot of decisions that would be, that once they're not private, once you're talking about externalities, those frequently become political issues. But it's not all politics. And I think that there's probably a view, especially among non-economists who know just a little bit about public choice, that it's all about politics, but it's about crime, it's about law, it's about religion, it's all these different ways that we structure society other than with just politics. Okay. So, but speaking of politics, my favorite book by Tullock is his book on autocracy. So a lot of public choice and the economics of politics looks at democracies. The calculus of consent is primarily about democracies. But he wanted to make it very clear that public choice wasn't just about democracy. You can apply the same lessons to thinking about dictatorships. And he's like, the way that historians and political scientists have been looking at, have been looking at autocracies is all wrong. We should be thinking about what is the economic incentives for the dictator, what are the incentives for the people under the dictator, for his potential rivals, etc. So one thing that comes out of it, Tullock is known for all these paradoxes, and I'll talk about a couple more, but a great paradox from the autocracy book is this paradox of revolution, where he basically says, look, it doesn't make sense to be a revolutionary. If you want there to be change personally, okay, you can't, your one person, your one action is not going to overcome the system. You need a lot of people, and if there are already a lot of people taking part in the revolution, then doesn't it make sense for you to just stay home and not take any of the risk and then just hope that everyone else is successful? Okay, so he said, but it's weird because revolutions seem to happen all the time. So could this possibly be? The way that he explained it is to essentially say, look, there's no such thing as a popular revolution. So revolutions are really just thinly veiled competitions between two groups of elites. So one group of elites in power, and the other group says, okay, well, we're going to have we'll have a revolution, and they'll walk around and they'll get a popular revolution by just kind of walking from town to town and forcing people who live in that town to join up with the revolution. You say, oh, well, they all just volunteered for a revolution, but if a bunch of armed revolutionaries come to your town and they have guns and they say, hey, do you want to join the revolution? You're probably not going to say no. That's probably not be a great idea. So other than just talking about the difference between dictatorships and democracies, he talked about the difference between what he called a dictatorship and a monarchy. So monarchy would have a hereditary system of government, and he talked about how the incentives are a bit different in that situation than if the dictatorship is controlled by just whoever is the most powerful at one given point. He talks about how the dictator is constrained by the fact that he's got to protect against all these people who are always looking to take his throne, take his power. So he can't just do whatever he wants, as many people suggest. So there's a lot to be said there, and I think this is a really important part of his legacy because this is a very underexplored area of his thought. I still think that there's not enough work done on how autocracies make decisions. Now, when he first wrote the book, he said, look, why aren't we looking at autocracy? This is the form of government that is most common. This is the form of government that's most common in history, and it's still definitely true that it's the most common form of government in history, but not quite so clear that autocracy is on the rise or anything like that. Since the time that he wrote this book, a lot of autocratic regimes have fallen and are at least nominally democratic now. So he's got some other paradoxes. This paradox of government growth is really interesting and certainly underexplored. His idea is, look, for thousands of years we had human society and governments were never that big. All of a sudden now you get to the 20th century and there's the skyrocketing in the size of government. So a few authors have tried to tackle this. I think certainly Bob Higgs and his work on ratchet theory, and Tyler Cowen and George Mason, a well-known blogger and economist, has written a bit about this paradox of government growth and how technology has enabled the government to grow much larger than it used to be. But no real good answer in my mind, certainly not a settled issue. He's also famous for this Tullock paradox of why is there so little money in politics? So since it seems that there is so much to gain by getting in power, having your friends be in power, it seems that people would be willing to spend a lot of money in order to seek these rents. And even though we're concerned with the amount of money that gets spent on lobbying and the amount of money that goes into campaigning and stuff like that, really, well, I just saw a graphic this past Halloween that more money is spent on Halloween candy than is spent on political campaigns. That's like all the political campaigns. So certainly it seems like it's worth more to be in power than people are willing to spend. So there's certainly a question that I don't think we have a good answer for. Why ultimately is there so little money in politics? I think some of the answers that have come out have something to do with money doesn't actually seem to buy votes in the way that many people have assumed. Once you get your person in power, there's very little guarantee that he will follow through with all the promises. So maybe it just doesn't make sense to invest in political rent seeking at that level. So another thing that Tullock is well known for among economists, but probably not the wider public, is his contributions to bioeconomics, or sociobiology, I guess you could also say. So he originally had a manuscript called Coordination Without Command, and then it eventually became a great book called The Economics of Non-Human Societies. There are some great stories of how he did his research for this book, of just standing outside of his office, looking at an ant colony, trying to figure out, well, what is it that they're doing? How can I explain their behavior economically? Yeah, kind of just applying the ideas not only to of economics, not only to politics and all these other non-market situations, but also to other types of animals and even plants. Okay, so he was really kind of looking at, well, how do agents coordinate, even if they don't have like an advanced language or an advanced society that we would call an advanced society and stuff like that. So he did a lot of the pioneering work on this, and I think it's very underexplored, and not very many people have written and really taken his insights into account, I think, on that area. He's also wrote a bit about natural suboptimality. So basically countering the idea that nature should come to some great conclusion. Okay, so one thing that he's saying is that in nature there's a lot of coordination, even though you don't have some big heavy hand. There's no command. Okay, so this is a very Hayekian, spontaneous order type idea. But on the other hand, he's saying just because an order is spontaneous doesn't necessarily mean it's good. Okay, so just because something is natural, the natural world doesn't necessarily mean that the natural world is good, even from the perspective of someone who appreciates nature. Okay, so say you really want some ecosystem to survive and thrive, some species of plants, some species of animals. Taking your preferences for granted, it's not necessarily true that just allowing nature to run its course is going to give you the best results as possible. So I think that a lot of what Tullock did, it seems like, was motivated by just like wanting to tick people off, but he would start thinking very critically about what other people truly believed, but he didn't really think had a good economic justification. So say that his legacy has an impact that's felt throughout economics. Certainly, he held a lot of very important positions. Southern Economic Association, American Economic Association, was the longtime editor of the journal Public Choice, wrote a lot of articles, wrote a number of books. A great collection of his work is published by Liberty Fund. I would definitely recommend picking that up. I'd say that his influence is particularly strong at George Mason, not just because these are people that I'm more familiar with, but these are people that he worked with and people who came to study under him and that kind of thing. So I would say, for example, Peter Leeson, Brian Kaplan, people who cite Tullock frequently and really grapple with Tullock's ideas and try to meet his challenges. So he's certainly a huge influence on people who are writing today. He'll certainly be an influence tomorrow, and I think years to come. His work touches so many topics that it could be the basis for a number of new research agendas. And when people ask me about graduate education in economics and what should I read, I always say Tullock. Tullock is a great jumping off point for almost any issue. Plus, if he wrote about it, you certainly want to read what he wrote because he's really smart. All right, so that's all the slides I have. So I guess I'm ready for Q&A.
Thanks so much. That's a great overview of someone who's certainly had a great impact. Where do you think his impact has been felt the most? I mean, in undergrad in political science, I never heard his name, but I heard a lot of ideas that he explored, particularly in one or two classes. And I would suspect that those professors had probably read Tullock in their PhD programs. But do you think it's in political science or economics, political economy?
I mean, certainly economics. I never talked to an economist who didn't know who Gordon Tullock was. I've certainly talked to plenty of political scientists who weren't familiar with his work. But I think even if you're not familiar with who Tullock is and exactly what he wrote, you can't really escape his impact at this point. So if you're working in political science, you really can't just sidestep the whole rational choice model of human behavior. So the political scientists are not going to take you seriously if you have just a complete naive civics class view of how the government works. And of course, that's not just Tullock, that's a lot of other writers, especially James Buchanan. But even if you don't know Tullock precisely, and a lot of people don't know his name and I think a lot of that is because of his personality. He was very abrasive. He liked to get on people's nerves, that kind of thing. Of course, everything I've heard is that all that is a big mask for the fact that he was a real softy at heart, and everyone who worked with him knew that he was, a great guy. He was very gracious to the people who worked for him and with him, and a lot of people who've been insulted by Tullock see that as a true badge of honor. So one of my great regrets in life is that I wasn't able to be insulted by Tullock. Yeah, so his influence in economics is huge. But I'd say more than other economists, his influence can be felt in a lot of other areas, particularly political science.
I guess I should tell people how they can ask questions. If you'd like to ask a question, you can ask in the little Q&A box in the bottom left. Another question from me. Why do you think it took so long for economists to get the idea that maybe they shouldn't assume that politicians have good intentions and kind of apply that insight to politics and look at incentives?
I mean, if you go all the way back to Bastiat and Adam Smith, and people were thinking about this. Now, they weren't thinking about it on the level of Tullock and Buchanan, I think, and they weren't using those modern tools. So I think that there's something weird that happened in political economy where the classical guys were really thinking about the relationship between all the different aspects of society. Certainly Adam Smith, not father of economics, but also working in a philosophical, moral philosophy tradition. And I think a lot of these guys really did understand that economics could apply to a lot of things, and somehow that was lost. The formalization of economics, the mathematization of economics, somehow it was lost, and I think people just got very risk averse, and they got into a particular way of thinking and following fashions. I mean, the sort of the battles in economics just keep repeating, coming over and over again. All these ideas now of is economics too formal? Are we asking big enough questions? These aren't just like topics that just came up. These are battles and debates that just keep happening over and over and over again. Great book on that topic is Larry White's Clash of Economic Ideas.
Now, how would you respond to the critique of some Austrians who would say that, the public choice, it's nice at a very top level thinking, but then they get way too formal about it and they get into the weeds?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's parts of, say, calculus of consent, which are a little bit too formal. I don't think that there's a lot gained with the mathematical models that they use. Certainly, there's some attempt to just kind of appeal to other economists. Maybe I'm alone in this thinking among other public choice economists, but what I focused on today, I tried to focus on the big ideas. And Tullock was a big ideas guy. He wasn't caught up in the formalization. He did a bit of that. He certainly knew how to do it and how to communicate in that way. But I think that's not really the biggest value gain in public choice. The biggest value gained is just the application of the economic way of thinking to a lot of different areas, which are which can get a lot of value out of applying that way of thinking. So I think that other people who are criticizing, say, Tullock for that, I think they need to go back and look at what he really said. And if you look at if you get caught up in some sort of mathematical model and you don't think it's relevant, then you can typically move on. I don't think that there's a ton of not the biggest part of the contribution at all.
Now, one of the problems when I first got into Austrian economics, there were all these resources there, and then I started hearing about public choice, and I was very interested, but there are so few public choice books online. There are many fewer papers than you get in kind of the more not mainstream, but kind of the more core Austrian stuff with Mises and Rothbard. You can find all of that online for free. How can we get these ideas out there more? Because I talk to Austrians on a regular basis who, I mean, they may have heard the term rational ignorance, and that's about as far as their understanding of these ideas goes. I mean, past an intuitive level.
Probably the best resource that I can think of. Probably the best resource that I can think of is the Library of Economics and Liberty. Go to econlib.org. I can put I'll put a link in the chat here, where you can read a lot of Tullock and Buchanan, especially Buchanan's work on public choice. I think if you look around, there's the public choice school is not as well organized, I think, as a group with some sort of coherent message, as perhaps other schools of thought that people are more familiar with. Certainly, there's a ton of Misesian stuff available online, Hayekian stuff that's available online. And there's probably, I guess, just a bigger fan club for that kind of thing. But if you look online, you can find most of what Tullock wrote, and you can find most of what Buchanan wrote, I think, without looking too hard. And just read articles that come out. I mean, there's especially if you have some kind of access to JSTOR or any kind of academic access, a lot of articles are available or have accessibility, even for people who are not professional economists. Tullock has an undergraduate book that he wrote that's available for sale, and let's see. Nothing else is jumping out at me. It's certainly not that wealth of information that you can find very easily, like you can find, say, all of Mises' stuff online. But like I said earlier, all the complete, or I guess you say the selected works, which is several volumes of Gordon Tullock's work, is published in a great anthology by Liberty Fund. So I definitely highly recommend that. And Buchanan's work, they also publish an anthology of his work. So if you're willing to spend a little bit of money, you can own those books.
And other than those, are there any books that you would recommend for people who are really getting into these ideas?
Sure. But certainly Tullock isn't the end of this school of thought. He's got a lot of great stuff, but I think if you're looking at the modern application of public choice, the best book in public choice, I'd say, in the past couple decades is Brian Kaplan's Myth of the Rational Voter. So once you kind of understand where Buchanan and Tullock were coming from, then you can understand a lot of the critiques that were given of that view, say from the Chicago School, Donald Whitman, that kind of thing. And then I think you come back around to Brian Kaplan to understand how you can counter those arguments and reach the same conclusions that Tullock and Buchanan reached about the efficiency of government and the types of incentives that government actors have. Also, I really highly recommend, if you love Tullock, you'll love Peter Leeson. So I definitely recommend Peter Leeson's work. He's got several books, articles coming out every day. He's a machine. and he's very Tullockian in my mind. Also an economist, and a natural economist. So can't really think of anything that's jumping out at me other than that, but that's a good place to start.
What do you think is the most important idea from public choice that hasn't really been subsumed into the zeitgeist and by other economists?
Um, so I think that Buchanan and Tullock, most economists are they grapple with a little bit, but I still think that there's a little bit of resistance to the idea that you can apply the economic way of thinking to any topic. So that I still think that there's resistance to that even in the economics profession, which that's unfortunate, but there's still a little bit of that there. As far as any single idea that hasn't really caught on, I think that the idea of rational irrationality in Brian Kaplan's work is very underappreciated. It's not just because I worked with him, but I don't think that the idea that people have preferences over beliefs is taken quite seriously enough in the wider profession. So, I mean, the idea of political economy is certainly making a comeback, and the institutional approach to economics is huge. Recently, Eleanor Ostrom's work was honored by the wider profession, and that, of course, fits very nicely in with this whole Virginia political economy, Austrian economics, institutional economics framework that I think is making a real comeback. And if you look at work of even some really prominent mainstream economists like Daron Acemoglu, and you look at the work that he's doing, it's not naive, but it still doesn't fully appreciate what Buchanan and Tullock were doing, I think. It focuses on too many small details, a little bit of technical prowess over really getting at what the ideas are. Let's see, what else? Right. I think just the behavioral idea. Many George Mason types and Austrian types might get mad at me for saying this, but I'm thinking the idea that people have preferences over beliefs, the Brian Kaplan type stuff. I don't think that people who are even working in public choice right now are taking that quite seriously enough. But it is starting to come back. There's a bit of work being done on political entrepreneurship and how politicians kind of manufacture issues in order to drum up support. So some really great work being done there by Deanna Thomas and people working with her. So I think that it's certainly an active area of research that is a bit underappreciated, but it really has been had a lot of impact. So, like I said, I don't think that there are people who don't know Tullock or don't know his work. The stuff on the sociobiology stuff, that basically nothing has been done with. From Tullock's point of view, and it's not my area of expertise, certainly, but I'm always looking for people who are going to cite the economics of non-human societies. I think that there's more important work that can be done there.
Well, very cool. I mean, thanks so much for giving this rundown. I know a lot of people just still aren't really familiar with this line of thought, and I hope we can push this video and maybe get more people to understand these ideas. Thanks so much for coming and talking to us, and thank you for honoring Tullock in this way. And I appreciate you coming. Thanks everyone for coming tonight. I'll actually put out a last call here for questions and let people know what's going on at Liberty Me Live. Sunday night, we've got the continuation of Jeffrey Tucker's Liberty Classics series. Monday night, we've got Professor Stephen Miller. He's going to talk about one reason why education is overrated. And then Tuesday night, we're going to have Lucy Steigerwald and Angela Keaton from antiwar.com. And they always are very entertaining and informative. So hope to see you all back here in the next week at Liberty Me Live. Looks like we're out of questions. So thanks so much, Zach. Thanks, everyone, for coming. Have a great night.
Thanks. Afterwards, he passed the what's notoriously difficult foreign service examination and did some work for the U.S. State Department in China, which they trained him on how to speak Chinese. He did some work at Yale learning that, and his experience in China led him to write a couple of articles on the monetary economics of China and Korea. Got those published before he ever stepped foot back in a university at a graduate level. He spent several years there, and I think that his work there got him to really think about the economics of politics, and really got him thinking. He wrote a lot on the economics of bureaucracy at this time, would eventually publish a book on that topic. After the Foreign Service, he came back and got into an academic career. University of South Carolina. He would eventually join Jim Buchanan at UVA, which they had a great department there, which they completely ruined by failing to promote certain people, failing to give them the support that they needed. They at one point had Coase, Buchanan, Tullock, and their work together is very highly cited in the profession. So he'd studied law, and he intended to become a lawyer, which he did. He was an attorney for a couple of years, and he was an okay attorney. He won some cases, but his heart wasn't really in it. But he was interrupted from his studies to go participate in World War II. He was part of the infantry, the 9th Infantry, landed on Normandy for the D-Day invasion. So he once said, under democracy, I found myself walking up a beach in Normandy, and I wasn't very happy about it. And that was part of his, I guess, one of his many quips that he's known for. And he was often very quick to denounce sacred cows that people had. So. Okay, so military service, which he wasn't very happy about, and he always said was uneventful, even though he crossed the Rhine went into what would eventually be Russian territory. He was all over Europe during that campaign. Thanks, Matt. So I was asked to come talk about Gordon Tullock's legacy, which is certainly an honor to do so. Gordon Tullock is one of my biggest influences personally, but he certainly influenced a lot of economists with greater note than me. So let's get to it. Gordon Tullock. Oh, there's supposed to be a Tullock picture here. Anyway, he did unfortunately die last year. Of course, it's not too late for the Nobel Committee to change their mind and start offering prizes to posthumously, but given their current rules, he will never get the prize that he deserves. But he is best known for his work in public choice theory and rent seeking. I guess rent seeking is part of public choice theory, but public choice theory is a broad program of research in economics, and rent seeking is probably the idea that he's most known for. So we'll talk about both of those contributions to some extent here. Education-wise, he received his JD in 1947 from
Liberty Me Live. We're here tonight with Zach Gochenour. We're going to be talking about the legacy of Gordon Tullock, who unfortunately died last month. He was a great economist, though he didn't have a PhD in economics, he probably contributed more to the way economists think about the economics, the political economy of politics, than almost anyone else almost anyone who had an economics degree. So we're here with Zach Gochenour, of course, who is a visiting assistant professor of economics at Western Carolina University. He got his PhD from George Mason and also got his bachelor's degree in economics and a BA in mathematics from George Mason as well. He was a research assistant for Professor Brian Kaplan, who many of you certainly know and respect. And he writes on the economics of immigration and also has a paper that's one of my favorite papers of last year on war and presidential greatness with David Henderson. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Zach.
University of Chicago, which he would later, way later, get an honorary PhD in economics from University of Chicago. But he actually only took one class in economics as an undergraduate, and he doesn't have a baccalaureate degree because he failed to, or decided not to, give them the $5 remittance required in order to get his BA. So he only has his JD, which was interrupted a bit by the fact that he was drafted to fight in World War II. So we'll talk a little bit about his personal life there. Yes, one class is all you need, especially if you're Gordon Tullock, who is, as Buchanan used to always say, his frequent collaborator and famous co-writer there, would say that he's a natural economist, and that is certainly true. He had a natural, I guess you'd say, affinity for the study of economics, and he wrote articles in economics and got them published before he even had any sort of academic appointment. So we'll talk a little bit about that too. So he spent much of his career with James Buchanan, who is pretty well known as well. Also passed away recently, unfortunately.